Okay, calm down.
Speaking of the things that our tax dollars are going to, here is the Israeli ambassador, Danny Dayan, speaking at the UN, and you question him about Israel's posture when it comes to Lebanon and Hezbollah.
So this was just before the Nasrallah assassination, like a day or two before.
Our position regarding Lebanon has always been very clear. We would prefer a diplomatic solution. We are entirely focused on achieving our objectives, which in the north is the return of our displaced citizens who have become refugees in their own country, back to their homes, back to their schools, back to their families. The suffering is always on our mind. If diplomacy fails to return our residents to their homes, then we will use all means at our disposal in accordance with international law to achieve our aims. And we will continue to target the terrorists. But all of this can stop immediately. Once Hezbollah will stop firing missiles and rockets into our civilian communities, there will be no cycle of violence in the region.
Hezbollah says they'll stop if you do a ceasefire in Gaza. So if you really care about the people in the north, why don't you do that?
The linkage that Iran decided to do between Hezbollah and Hamas, holding the people of Lebanon hostage, that's something which I'm not familiar with. How can you do that?
So everyone should just follow. You asked me a question. You asked me a question.
I'm answering your question.
You asked me a question. So the world should just step aside as you do all this carnage. The world should just step aside as you commit genocide. You asked me a question.
You ask a question, you get an answer. The linkage that the Iranian regime did between Hezbollah and Hamas, holding the Lebanese people hostage, that's not done. You don't start a war with Israel just because you want to show sympathy for the atrocities of Hamas.
You told The Hague to go to hell.
The Prime Minister of Lebanon.
That's so moving at the beginning where he talks about how much he cares about civilians. But what's your response? If you could have kept going on with him, what would you like to have said to him?
Oh gosh, well, yeah, I mean, it's a very unlevel playing field. You know, he's at a podium, I'm being elbowed by other reporters and so on. So, you know, I don't mean to take on every false thing that he says there, or
right, of course,
implicitous thing that he says there.
Because you didn't have all day.
Yeah, well, yeah, or any, you know. So, I mean, the crux of it is that they are saying that they want to be able to slaughter people in Gaza without anybody doing anything to stop them. From Hezbollah's and from Yemen's point of view, that they're in effect, you know, quite arguably saying we're implementing international law here. They don't quite put it in those terms, but implicitly, the international community has called for a ceasefire, has recently passed a General Assembly resolution, you know, telling Israel to withdraw from occupied territory and immediately, and so on and so forth. And Israel just shrugs it off. It tells The Hague, it tells anybody and everybody to, you know, go jump in a lake. So in effect, Hezbollah and Yemen are saying, you better do this. And Hezbollah was very clear in their statements, saying, we will stop if you stop wreaking havoc in Gaza. We will stop. We will allow Israelis to return to the north and so on. So Israel isn't concerned about people in the north. They want what they are asserting is their right to slaughter people in Gaza. And one sort of weird effect of the threat of a quote unquote wider war vis-a-vis Lebanon or vis-a-vis Iran is it almost takes the focus off of Gaza, so that like one crime is a distraction from the last crime. And it shouldn't be the case. They should be, a cumulative indictment, if anything.
What's fascinating is that there is absolutely no consistency when it comes to the way the Western media and political elites judge the actions of Israel and Lebanon. So everything that Israel does is self-defense. It's somehow supporting the rules-based order. Everything that Hezbollah does is terrorism. Everything that Iran does is terrorism. There's never any discussion of the, civilians killed when you're talking about terrorism. That's kind of irrelevant. It's not about the number of civilians killed. That's not what determines whether it's terrorism. What determines whether it's terrorism is whether or not the government or the country doing it or the people doing it are the adversaries of the United States.
Yeah.
And I mean, I guess that this is naive, but I was a little bit surprised by how much joy the West was sharing in its reaction to the killing of Nasrallah.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, this is, the US has this, we designate who's a terrorist thing, and they put Hezbollah on the list, and it's just, there's no adjudication process or anything like that. It's just, the State Department draws up a list and they decide who it gets proclaimed as a terrorist, and the media just regurgitate that ad nauseum. So, I mean, there have been some decent reports, sometimes very old ones. Somebody was Decensored News, I think, clipped an old 60 Minutes thing where they actually sat down with Nasrallah and talked to them, and talked about the complexity of the organization and so on. And there have been times when Hezbollah was positively depicted. I remember that, in 2006, like the Daily Show, was impressed that they were able to clean up the mess after Israel bombed the crap out of Lebanon. But in times like this, the media, establishment media, predictably kick in and just dredge up the same old caricatures rather than talking about it in the political and in context in terms of what's going on in Gaza.
Could you tell us about your own family's history in this region? I know your family is Palestinian.
Sure. My dad was born in the Galilee, in Tiberias, and he was driven out in 1948. He was 16 years old at the time, along with hundreds of thousands of other Palestinians. He was initially driven out to southern Lebanon, but he had a relative in Jordan, ended up in Jordan, in Zerka, which, at the time was nothing. There was an army base, I think, there was the only thing there, and they started a refugee camp there, and it eventually became a city. But it started as just a refugee camp in 1948, and that's where he grew up. My mom is Jordanian, from Jordan, from Adaba. They're both, he's Catholic, she's Orthodox Christian. I've gone several times to Palestine, sometimes with him in Tiberias, the West Bank, and Gaza.
Do you still have family there?
Distant, barely in touch with. Most of my family's in Jordan. My more immediate cousins are in Amman.
Well, and I'm sorry, I know that your father passed away. You've written about that before he was able to go back.
When he was facing his death, he ended up being buried in a grave. There are very limited graves in the Christian cemetery in Jordan, and he couldn't be buried next to his mother. His mother died in Jordan as well. The family was dispersed and broken up after 1948. His father, it happened in the summer, and he was visiting other relatives in a nearby village called Lebanon, which was ethnically cleansed. His father and his youngest brother were able to remain in what is now Israel, but they both died, and therefore Israel was able to confiscate all of their property. And one of the times when I went back with my dad to Palestine, we saw a lawyer in Nazareth, and he looked up all the records, and it had in English his father's name, Yusuf Husseini, Joseph, basically scratched out, and in Hebrew what Arabs call hintish bintish, which is a quasi-government entity that is designed to allocate land for the use of Jewish people exclusively. So that's how their property holdings were handled.
I'm sorry about everything that you and your family and all people from Palestine are going through, and I can't believe that our government is doing this.